Welcome to meeting number 111 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. I do want to start by recognizing that we are meeting on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples and express gratitude that we're able to do the important work of this committee on lands they've stewarded since time immemorial. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted on Wednesday, April 10th, 2024, the committee is meeting to continue its study on Report 2, Housing in First Nations Communities, of the 2024 Reports 2 to 4 of the Auditor General of Canada. Before I begin, I would like to ask that all members and other in-person participants to consult the cards on the table for guidelines to prevent audio feedback incidents. Please take note of the following preventative measures in place to protect the health and safety of all participants, including the interpreters. Only use a black approved earpiece. The former gray earpieces must no longer be used. Keep your earpiece away from all microphones at all times. And when you're not using your earpiece, place it face down on the sticker placed on the table for this purpose. Thank you all for your cooperation. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format in accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses. I am informing the committee that all witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of this meeting, and I hope, Mr. Lemire, your connection will be sufficient to get going. But with that, I would like to welcome our witnesses today. We have the Honourable Patty Haidju, Minister of Indigenous Services, and the Honourable Sean Fraser, Minister of Housing, Infrastructure and Communities, and they are accompanied by from the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, Nadine LeBlanc, and from the Department of Indigenous Services, Candice Saint-Aubin. So, ministers, you will each have the floor for 5 minutes, starting with Minister Haidju.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much to the committee for having me back yet again. I think it's my third time in the last few weeks, and it's a joy to be with you here on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe. I am hoping that the next time I come back, we will be talking about the Clean Water Act. The First Nations Clean Water Act is a very important piece of legislation that this committee will have the privilege of studying. And the AFN and other parties have been very clear. They're asking all parties to move quickly to get the bill to committee so that we can listen to witnesses. And I am hoping that we will not see continued blockage of this bill by any party, because this is a deeply important piece of legislation to many First Nations across the country. Mais parlons de rapport de la vérificatrice.
But let's talk about the Auditor General report. It shows how important partnership with First Nations is important. This problem is not new. It's a problem that too many Indigenous people have gone through for their entire lives. It is the result of decades of colonialism and oppression, and it proves an important point. Racism is expensive. Today, the bill for the infrastructure deficit is $350 billion. Let's be clear, there have been some progress, but this will not be resolved overnight. We will need an effort at all levels of government, as well as from organizations and private corporations.
Archaic one-size-fits-all systems that are often in place. They are not only deeply insulting to First Nations, but they simply don't work. We all remember the paternalistic $300 million fund that, in fact, the Leader of the Opposition oversaw when he was minister. And in fact, that program did not work either. It got exactly 99 homes built on reserve for $300 million. This is why First Nations housing solutions must be developed by or co-developed with First Nations themselves, and they must be flexible so that they can meet the specific needs of each community. And that's what the National First Nations Housing and Related Infrastructure Strategy is all about. It was co-developed with the AFN, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and First Nations across Canada. And it's a clear contrast with the paternalistic approach. It will get us closer to a Canada where First Nations also have a safe place to rest, to raise their children, and to reach their full potential. Recently, I was in Lytton First Nation, and they're making giant steps in rebuilding after a devastating wildfire. With new funding, 20 homes are being fast-tracked, and they plan to build over 175 homes over the next decade. And this is no coincidence. Indeed, since we took office in 2015, Liberals increased targeted funding in housing by 1,100%, and Budget 2024 adds another $1 billion. Equally important, the tools that we're developing together with First Nations people is restoring control of housing back to communities. We've supported First Nations Housing Professionals Association to train people on project management, construction planning, tenant relations and renovation coordination, and they've certified 48 housing professionals. They have an additional 151 people in training, and this is to build housing capacity in First Nations communities across the country. I saw that in action in Lytton myself. In fact, they said the speed at which they've been able to develop the division and get the infrastructure in place so the housing could be put into place for families that had lost their homes in that devastating wildfire was because of internal capacity within the community. The difference between the Liberal approach and the Conservative attitude is clear. Conservatives are stuck in paternalistic thinking, combined with a spin of austerity. On our end, we focus on closing the gap through partnership and mutual respect. It's the right thing to do in the spirit of reconciliation, but it's also the only approach that works. And it's the only way that we can ensure a fairer future and a fairer Canada for Indigenous peoples. Miigwech, thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Haidju. And next up, we will give the floor for 5 minutes to Minister Fraser.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, chers collègues. C'est un plaisir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to be here and talk about this very important issue.
For having me. It's clear that Canada is experiencing a housing crisis, and that crisis is felt disproportionately by Indigenous communities across Canada. When I hear about the challenges, when I speak with those who are most impacted, they tell me stories of overcrowding in their communities, of risks to health that can manifest as a result of that overcrowding, about a seeming lack of understanding about the challenges of those of us who come from the South when it comes to the actual process of building in Canada's north. We see a disproportionate representation of Indigenous peoples amongst homeless Canadians, and it's essential that we acknowledge where we are if we're going to get where we want to be. We've seen over the course of Canada's history a lack of investment that would be necessary to actually close the gap when it comes to the housing needs amongst Indigenous peoples in this country and everyone else. The housing crisis, obviously, over the course of the past year or so has really captured the attention of Canadians. But I still think there's insufficient light been shone upon the extraordinary needs of Indigenous communities across Canada. We've taken a step in a new direction.
Sorry for interrupting, but I'm not seeing the transcription in French.
Make sure the interpretation's working.
Confirm the translation's working. Il est essentiel. OK. OK. Merci, Monsieur le Maire. OK. Alors, je vais continuer. We took a step in a new direction a number of years ago, not only with a significant increase in funding, as Minister Haidju described, but more and more ensuring that we're empowering Indigenous communities and Indigenous leaders to take decisions about the investments that will support Indigenous communities. We've seen, I see Mr. Batiste from Nova Scotia here, this approach in other areas has delivered immense dividends. I'm thinking of the education reforms that were put in place a number of years ago in Nova Scotia that dramatically increased graduation rates when decision-making power over the education system was put in the hands of Indigenous communities. We aim to do more of that with the distinctions-based approach that we've taken towards new funding, with $4 billion behind it to build out more housing in communities, with the approach towards urban, rural, and northern communities that's going to, again, work with distinctions-based organizations, but also an Indigenous-led center that will help make decisions about where the funding goes. But it's not enough to just change the process. You actually have to back these programs up with serious money. As Minister Haidu's indicated, we've seen an 1,100% increase in the total funding going to initiatives specifically for Indigenous housing. This also comes through programs that may involve bilateral agreements with other levels of government who make investments directly in communities. It would include affordable housing initiatives through the Affordable Housing Fund or the Rapid Housing Initiative, which we've seen deliver, in particular, about 40% of the investments have gone to support Indigenous housing initiatives. We've seen significant uptake with the Housing Accelerator Fund with partners that lead Indigenous communities. These investments are starting to make a difference, but I'm not here to tell you that the problem has been solved. I'm here to tell you that we need to continue to do more. With consistent and predictable investments, we'll be able to create an ecosystem where we're doing a better job of meeting the demands that dramatically and disproportionately impact Indigenous communities. We have more work to do to not only ensure that we meet the housing needs, but create opportunities for Indigenous communities to realize the economic benefits by actually delivering on those housing needs. I think about conversations I've had in Iqaluit when I was visiting MP Idlot in her community, where we heard loud and clear that despite the fact there's significant investments going to Canada's north for housing as compared to years past, many of the economic benefits go to the companies who provide goods and services from the south. We have continuous learning opportunities, but we have to take our lead from those who are most impacted. And I'm looking forward in the months and years ahead to increasing the pace of delivery and the understanding of how the federal government can support Indigenous communities in meeting the housing needs to bring to an end the housing crisis which they've been living through for far too many years. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much, Minister Fraser. And with that, we'll go into the first round of questioning, starting with 6 minutes to Mr. Schmill.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Ministers, for being here today. Minister Fraser, you just mentioned about your desire to keep doing more. However, this is the fourth Auditor General report on Indigenous housing, and yet there has been little to no improvement, according to her report. Where are the homes you promised?
So there are tens of thousands of homes that have been built or repaired since we formed government through the programs that we've advanced. I would accept the recommendations of the Auditor General, which don't remain uniform as between reports. And in fact, one of the reasons that it's essential we maintain that position is so that we can have continued assessment of where we at vis-a-vis where we need to be. So the specific homes that you're asking about would depend on each community. There's members represented here who have homes in their communities today that did not exist a number of years ago, and we need to accelerate the pace of that delivery.
So according to the report here, 55,320 housing units are needed to be built now until 2030 to keep on track. However, from 2018 to now, only 4,379, or 8% of the units have been completed, 13% are in progress, and 79% are still needed. So again, Minister, where are the homes?
So as I've mentioned, it will depend on which community you're talking about. We need to increase the pace of construction, and there's some irony in the question coming from a member whose party has a history of not making investments in housing in Indigenous communities.
Well, Minister, according to the Auditor General, there has been little to no improvement in the last four Auditor General reports, and last time I checked, you've been here for 9 years, and yet we are still dealing with the same problem. So again, where are the homes?
With respect, over those 9 years, every time there was an opportunity to support or vote for more investments in housing for Indigenous communities, you have voted against them. It's ironic for you to sit here and pretend to be a champion for Indigenous housing when your voting history has gone in the opposite direction at every opportunity.
It still does not let you off the hook for the past 9 years. Where are the homes?
There are tens of thousands of homes that have been added to the housing supply in Indigenous communities as a result of the investments we've made. Do we need to do more?
So
yes, absolutely.
Says little to nothing has changed. So you keep saying you have to do more, and it seems the track record of this government is to spend money and use that as their talking point, but outcomes have not been changing, and that's the thing we should be actually focusing on.
So I agree that we should be focusing on outcomes, but when I compare outcomes of tens of thousands of new homes existing compared to the 99 new homes that were built while your leader was the was the housing minister, it's clear there is no contest. Moreover, it's not reasonable for a Conservative MP to show up this committee and ask to do more on Indigenous housing when you have voted against money for Indigenous housing at every opportunity.
Well, you and your government have said Indigenous communities are the most important relationship. However, little to nothing has changed on the housing file. This is still substandard housing in many communities, and you're not even on track to meet the goals that you say you want to achieve. So again, what are you doing differently? You say you need to do more. Well, clearly nothing much has changed in the last 9 years. What is the more?
The more is
Par plus, j'entends l'investissement de ressources importantes dans la construction de logements pour les collectivités autochtones et aussi autonomiser ces communautés pour qu'elles décident comment cet investissement s'articule dans le concret. Ça, c'était pas du tout là dans la plateforme conservatrice. Nous, on va de l'avant avec un changement.
Hold on. It's a translation issue. How does this happen so often?
Good. Okay. You can continue your time. Yes.
Thank you, Chair. And Minister, it was the Residential Construction Council of Ontario that said there was no way the feds would meet their housing targets. So again, where are the homes you promised? 79% of units are still needed.
Mr. Chair, it's only been a few minutes and we've already seen the Conservative member move off the issue of Indigenous housing, much like they did while they had the opportunity to make investments and chose not to.
Well, I figure you're not going to answer the question, so I might as well try another topic.
We're here on a study to tackle the housing needs of Indigenous communities.
Chair, it's my time. Can I reclaim that time, please, Chair?
So you have your time. You still have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. So again, maybe we'll focus on the actual question I just asked. The Residential Construction Council of Ontario said there was no way the federal government would meet their housing targets. So again, where are the homes?
Mr. Chair, I have 2 points in response. First of all, we've been at this committee for about 3 minutes now, and the Conservatives have already changed the subject from Indigenous housing, much as they avoided it while they were last in office.
Chair.
Second, and he keeps interrupting to ruin the audio because he's embarrassed of the answer here, and he should be embarrassed because, Mr. Chair, do I have the floor? I want to respect the interpreters, but this is inappropriate.
Order, please. We got to think of the interpreters here when we're having this types of crosstalk happening. The interpretation is not getting through. I'm listening to the French interpretation right now, and it's difficult when we have two people talking. So if we can just have one at a time, please. Mr. Smale, your time's back to you.
Thank you very much. Again, rent has doubled, housing has doubled, housing costs have doubled, food bank usage is at record highs. Minister, we're talking about housing that, by all accounts, many of the people actually building housing say your government has no plan and will not reach your target. So again, it's a simple question, Minister. Where are the housing? Where are the houses?
Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair, rather, now that I have the floor, I trust I can make this point without interruption. This is a study about the housing needs of Indigenous communities across this country. It has been a few minutes, and the Conservatives are now resorting to reading questions off their phone, off topic, because they feel like they can't have a serious conversation about this issue. There was years where they had the opportunity to make the investments and chose not to. Sorry, Mr. Chair, I'm being spoken over. Every time I make this argument, he talks over me. Do I have the floor?
I'm not going to let him take my time,
Mr. Chair, do I have the floor?
You have the floor.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, with respect to my friend and colleague, he had many years as his party in office to make investments or not make investments in Indigenous housing. They chose not to. Now he has an opportunity to ask questions about it, and instead he's looking at his phone to ask questions he's reading from the leader's office rather than actually engaging on the issue of housing in Indigenous communities. It's inappropriate.
Well, Chair,
with respect, he says we have no plan, and again, he's talking over. He's very uncomfortable with this argument. He says we have no plan.
Mr.
Chair, do I have the floor?
I want to reclaim my time.
Mr. Chair, do I have the floor?
30 seconds.
Do I have the floor?
This is not answering my question. He doesn't get to
Mr. Chair, sorry, there's been no point of order. Do I have the floor?
You do have the floor.
Thank you. I have respected my colleague while he was speaking. I would appreciate if he would return the professional courtesy. He suggested we don't have a plan. We literally published a plan in April of this year. He may think it's foreign because the plan that he put forward as a party has no measures in it that will actually build more homes. With respect, we have...
Point of order. Mr. Shields?
Thank you, Chair. I would suggest that the member, Mr. Smale, be able to ask his question. It's his time. And the minister is going on and talking about other
nonsense.
things. So he needs to be able to reclaim his time to be able to speak and ask questions.
So, Mr. Smale, you still have, I'll give you one more question, okay?
Thank you very much. Chair, I appreciate the opportunity. Again, we are not seeing your targets met on for non-First Nations or Indigenous communities and across the country. There have been no targets being met. You're not on track anywhere in this country to meet your housing targets. You say you have to do more, fine, but the last 4 Auditor General's report said nothing has changed. So I want to know specifically what is going to change.
So first, with respect to the issue of targets, the targets outlined in the National Housing Strategy under our bilateral agreements and affordable housing investments have delivered more units than were set out as a goal at the outset. But we need to do more, as I've mentioned repeatedly, and we have broadcasted a series of measures in the recent housing plan that are going to increase the investments. The Conservatives seem to struggle with the idea that you should set a target that's going to solve a problem, not one that your measures are going to lead to anyway. A final comment, because I expect I'm going to run out of time. During the last exchange, I should point out when one of the members said something about what I was talking about, the questioner has said it was nonsense. Investments in housing for Indigenous peoples in this country is not nonsense. It may appear that way given the questions today and the history of the Conservative Party, but for the record, the government takes a different view.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smale. With that, we're going to go to our second questioner in the first round, Mr. McLeod. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the ministers for joining us today. Very important topic for me, very important topic for my constituents. In my previous life, I had the honor of being the housing minister for the government of Northwest Territories. So I've been looking at the issue of housing for many, many years. And I can tell you for a long time, we've been in a housing crisis, and Minister Fraser, you mentioned that we have a crisis on our hands, and that crisis has been there for many years. And during the time of the Conservative Party being in power, there was virtually no dollars coming for Indigenous housing. So now we have 2 streams of funding coming to the Northwest Territories, Indigenous Service money and CMHC money, but we're still in a crisis, except we're in a crisis with a little bit of light shining through the tunnel because for the first time in our history, we have Indigenous housing money coming to the Northwest Territories for the very first time. And we also have CMHC programs that are being tapped into by our communities. You know, we have communities from our smallest communities like Nahanni Butte to our largest center of Yellowknife, where they're accessing the Housing Accelerator Fund. They're putting up houses through the Rapid Housing Program and homelessness investment. So it's very good to see all that investment coming to the Northwest Territories. But of course, we have to do more. And I would really like to see the 2 streams of funding to continue. And the Auditor General's report that we're talking about today, it doesn't cover housing in the Northwest Territories Indigenous communities. And it only focuses on First Nations south of 60, which is very disappointing to me because information, statistics are very important when it comes to budgeting, and I raised it with the Auditor General, and I understand the Auditor General will be reviewing housing in the Northwest Territories, and we'll be looking at the Territorial's housing agency, and that sounds like it's going to happen later on this year. So I look forward to reading her office's findings. But my question to both of you as ministers is to discuss how ISC and CMHC, respectively, are working directly with Indigenous governments and organizations in the Northwest Territories to address housing needs of their communities.
Well, thank you very much, MP McLeod, and thanks for your ongoing advocacy for northern communities, especially in Northwest Territories. And you're right, the Auditor General's audit didn't look at First Nations communities First Nations communities in Northwest Territories or the other territories, because almost all of on-reserve First Nations communities are located in the provinces. So I'm glad that you had a chance to speak with her about how to get that data from northern communities that are self-governing in many cases. I think what we've learned, especially through emergency management, is that we need to work more closely with the province, with the territories. And quite frankly, the experience that I had last summer supporting Ketlodici, as you know, with the crisis that they were experiencing resulting from the wildfire, feeling really unheard in many ways by the territory at that particular time. Really, I think, informed us in terms of the work that we can do to support the territories in their obligation to meet the housing needs of self-governing people and work with self-governing First Nations to result in more housing. I mean, the good news is that there was an announcement just in let me just find it here, just in I thought I saw this on my sheet. Yes, here it is. January 18th, 2024, CMHC provided almost $19 million more to support building 54 homes in Indigenous communities in Northwest Territories. So you can see that this idea that we need to work more closely with self-governing First Nations, with First Nations that are in territories, is starting to percolate throughout departments. And maybe I can turn to Minister Fraser to talk about CMHC and that evolution.
Certainly. So in terms of how we engage directly, I think this is important. And maybe before I answer, I'll say thank you. Michael, it was you personally who opened my eyes to the dramatic need to increase investments a few years ago in advance of the Budget 2022 decision to increase distinction-based funding to the tune of $4 billion. And I think you're being a champion for housing in the North has reached those of us who come from other parts of the country. And I think it's an example of you providing sincere value to the work that we do in Ottawa. Let me say that engagement directly with communities has got to be a big part of the answer. Minister Haidu mentioned a moment ago some of the investments that CMHC has made. We do that through the Housing Accelerator Fund, with reaching deals directly with communities, through Reaching Home, 51 projects just in the Northwest Territories, by leveraging resources like the Rapid Housing Initiative to identify project proponents who have the capacity to deliver, and through our distinction-based funding by engaging directly with rights holders and empowering them to make decisions about their own communities, but acting as a reliable partner when it comes to funding. I see I'm out of time here, but I just want to reiterate my gratitude for the work that you do.
Thank you very much, Mr. McLeod. And après ça, notre prochain...
And the next member, Mr. Lemire, for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the interpreters, can you tell me if my sound is okay? I had an issue with my internet connection. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I'm calling in from Montreal exceptionally this morning because it is the 2024 event of Indigenous Circles, which is funded by Indigenous Services Canada. And up to now, the federal government hasn't had a presence there. There are a few fundamental issues here, and one of them reminded me of the meeting that took place this morning. The introductions this morning highlighted the importance of reducing the gaps. There's a great gap in terms of economic wealth and poverty. This exists in the area of housing. Minister Fraser, how are you planning to close this gap between Indigenous communities that are wealthier and those that don't have the means to build enough housing?
Premièrement, merci pour les...
First of all, thank you for the question. It's very important to equalize the situation and the circumstances. Now, the first thing is that we have to increase investments in communities that don't have the resources to improve the situation there. That is why we are going to create funds to support communities and create powers within their communities for them to do what they need to.
Circumstances. Communities tend to know their needs, but we have to put resources on the table. At the same time, this is a broader conversation perhaps, that we increase resources, creating opportunities for success within communities by partnering not just on housing projects, but on other instances. For example, in my home province, a new opportunity to create an equity stake in green battery storage for Mi'kmaq communities is going to create additional financial resources. So it's a combination of setting the table for success and making the investments necessary to help play catch-up at risk of dramatically oversimplifying a very complex challenge.
And if I could add, Mr. Chair.
La réalité.
No.
Allez-y.
Go ahead.
It's not just a matter of additional funding. It is, as I think my colleague has spoken about, it's about additional financing models. And so I'm sure we spoke juste le semaine passée.
Just last week, we spoke about Yananichi projects such as that one.
Investments that First Nations receive through the federal government and that actually change the dynamic of the housing market on First Nations. And so I think there's way more we can do leveraging investments to attract private capital and many other tools that can accelerate this work. Thank you for a very good question.
Merci, Madame la Ministre.
Thank you, Madam Minister. And actually, this leads me to another question, which is about the Yananichi program. There is Indigenous expertise being developed by Indigenous people. What I find shocking is that when you look at Indigenous housing, the budgets allow for the creation of 2 housing units. And if you look at the baby boom, it really doesn't respond to the actual needs. So there are other issues that I'd also like to hear you on, Minister Fraser. How are you going to deal with the standards that are required in Indigenous communities that you can't apply in the same way as in a traditional white city? There are standards and very short timelines. Often within 2 years, you have to put the shovels in the ground and also work on water management. So it's a wonderful thing to announce millions of dollars in investment, but a lot of that money comes back to Treasury Board and is not actually used within those Indigenous communities. So how do you propose to fix that?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question.
To clarify some details. I think the first stage for me is to not exclusively have programs that are driven by decisions made in Ottawa. One, putting the resources in the hands of communities who know their priorities is an essential ingredient if we're going to actually solve some of these problems. 2 is we need to continue to be increasing the resources that are going to solve the problem if we're going to achieve meaningful progress. But it's even more complicated than you've laid out in your question. Some of the nuances require us to understand that building housing in Indigenous communities is different and more expensive in many instances than it can be in other communities. Take Canada's North, for example, when you're dealing not only with challenging construction seasons, but a need to understand that a sea lift year only allows you to deliver the supplies to build houses during certain portions of the year. Engaging directly with communities and empowering them to make decisions about how those resources will be administered will deliver a far greater understanding of how to solve the problem efficiently than you would if you were instead making decisions behind closed doors on Parliament Hill. So engaging with communities, increasing resources, and trusting leaders to understand the needs of their communities are all essential ingredients to move forward and achieve progress.
And Mr. Chair, if I might add, I just want to correct, there is no money that's turned back to Treasury Board from my department. Over the past 3 years, we've spent the entirety of our allocation, and in fact have moved money very quickly to communities that have that can utilize that money as, if projects are delayed in other spaces.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Lemire.
Thank you, Mr. Lemire. Your time is up.
Last question in the first round. Ms. Idlow, you have 6 minutes.
Koyan nami exhibitore amaro koyan nami kaigasi sivod lang mi aperine gama gavama pilire reyangin ne kayasakte tukjak mixana.
Ms. Idlow, so we just need to pause for a second. We're not getting interpretation.
Yes, here we go. Are we set? Yeah. Thank you, Chair. Briefly, I will ask very briefly. The Auditor General states that there was an increase in investments. But, to quote, they wrote, they found that in 2023, 80% of needs were still not being met. We know for decades now, and over decades again, I say housing needs have been underinvested. My question is for CMHC. Knowing these, why did you choose to use 2001 data to make your allocations?
Chair, the allocation was co-developed with the First Nations during that time in near 2001, and considered many factors, including Stats Canada's census, but also included suitability, overcrowding, and specific regional needs. And as presented by the Auditor General, CMHC is committed to review this allocation and work with First Nations to co-develop the new formula, which will include the new census data, but as well as other factors that First Nation deemed important in prioritizing their housing needs, and that will be a priority of CMHC to do.
2001
Since 2001, that's quite a while ago. Why is it that you have not updated the stats and the information to more current dates?
The country to understand the needs of First Nations across regional and local.
I'm interrupting you because you're not responding to my question. I will go on to the next one. I will ask Haidu. The Auditor General also coded, and they also found that and coded that unless the departments and corporations take meaningful action to address the issues, we will continue to have problems. It is unclear if the activities will be successful. Please produce an updated clarification how this might happen soon.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, first of all, I'd like to say that although obviously there needs to continue to be ambition in the investment and in the way of the investment, and I think Minister Fraser is exactly right, through a self-determined lens, through additional tools, through additional...
La traduction ne se fait pas en français.
Apologies for interrupting, but I can't hear the interpretation in French.
For 1 second here.
Okay, well, thank you very much, MP Idlout, for the question. And I will just say that I think your question points to two important things. One, that the ambition of investment can't slow down, that we all have to continue in each of our respective files and ways to ensure that the priority of Indigenous housing doesn't fall to the background noise that I think we can see and hear from MP Schmal's line of questioning. In fact, this is a priority for this government, and it's a priority for the country, in fact, because I think, as MP knows and many others, that if people don't have access to good housing, that it's very difficult to reach your full potential. But there is some positive progress. And I will say that the Government of Canada, in partnership with First Nations, conducts something called the Wellbeing Survey. And in 2016, First Nations reported an average community well-being score of 58. And in fact, by 2021, that average rose to 62. In fact, in terms of housing, First Nations reported an average community well-being housing score of 68 in 2016, and that rate rose to 73. And in 2016, there were 17 First Nations that reported community well-being housing scores of less than 40, and by 2021, we only saw 2 under that amount. And so this...
I apologize. I asked you.
Elapsed, Chair. Thank you very much, Ms. Idlout. That concludes the first round of questioning. We're moving on to the second round now, and I have Mr. Zimmer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister. My questions will be to you, Mr. Fraser. I was recently in Iqaluit. I met Kevin and his wife, Malaya. Kevin used to be a truck driver at the Nunavut mine, but is now out of a job due to the mine closing. He wanted a better life for his family, so he moved away from the rougher part of town where drugs and alcohol were prevalent. They moved into a small government-funded house with their daughter and 3 young grandsons. And that's where I met them just 2 months ago. Kevin and Malaya showed me there's mold in every corner. The bathroom plumbing is backed up and broken and has been that way for the last few years. He has had to cover every window with plastic to stop the frigid drafts to keep his family warm. In one case, one of the windows, if he was to open it, the grandkids could fall out. It's about a 15-foot fall if that window was to actually open. Their siding is falling off. The floors are falling apart. Malaya has had bad asthma and is often triggered by the ever-present mold. Minister, would you call this a success or a failure?
Sorry for interrupting. I can't hear the interpretation.
Mr. Zimmer, I'll start your time back up once you start.
Want me to start again?
Yes.
Okay. My questions will be for Minister Fraser. I was recently in Iqaluit just a few months ago. I met Kevin and his wife, Malaya. Kevin used to be a truck driver at a Nunavut mine, but is now out of a job due to the mine closing. He wanted a better life for his family, so he moved away from the rougher part of town where drugs and alcohol were prevalent. They moved into a small government-funded house with their daughter and 3 young grandsons in 2011. Yet, Kevin and Malaya showed me there is mold in every corner. The bathroom plumbing is backed up and has been broken and has been that way broken for the last few years. He has had to cover every window with plastic to stop the frigid drafts to keep his family warm. And in one case, there's a kitchen window that if he didn't keep it closed, his grandchildren could fall 15 feet down and be severely harmed as a result. The siding is falling off. The floors are falling apart. Malaya has had bad asthma and is often triggered by the ever-present mold. Minister, would you call this a success or a failure?
Anytime you're dealing with living conditions like you've just described, I think it's a signal that a greater level of investment needs to follow. Now, to be clear, Mr. Chair, do I have the floor? About the roughly the same amount of time as the questioner?
It's whether it was a success or a failure.
Mr. Chair, do I have the floor, and do I have as much time as the questioner?
Allow the minister to answer your question, please.
So I want to be careful when you're dealing with issues that are managed by Indigenous partners or territorial partners without having had the chance to discuss this specific issue with those who manage the program and labeling their work as a failure. And I hope you would not necessarily attribute that to them the way you've put it in your question. But I think anytime you see that quality of housing, it demands greater investment. So we'll continue to increase the resources for our partners who manage these issues, including presumably the project that you're referring to.
Minister, the question was to you. I'm not asking you to answer questions based on the other housing authorities that are in Nunavut. I'm asking because the federal government has a responsibility around housing, and I asked you a simple question whether it was a success or a failure. It clearly is a failure. I'll move on to my second question. Minister, you have been in government for 9 years, almost a decade. Are you familiar with the 2023 Northern Housing Report?
Yes.
Okay. From the report, 80% of families in Nunavut can't afford to buy a house. 51% of families can't even afford to rent a place to live. The average price of a single detached home reached a historical high of $724,504, which was an increase of almost 20% over the previous year. As of April this year, only 55% of residents have a job. Construction is down, residential construction is down, non-residential construction is down. The simple truth is the houses are not getting built, and you know that, Minister. And this is from a minister who is promising 4 million houses across the country. There's a need for at least 3,000 or more houses in Nunavut. It's not getting done. I'll read an article. Actually, Minister, I'll get back to my time is short. Would you call this, Minister, your housing record in Nunavut a success or a failure?
Mr. Speaker, again, just confirming I have time to answer this question given the length of the question that was put to me. I always ask myself a motivation behind certain questions. Mr. Chair, do I have the floor? I'm interrupted every time I raise the Conservatives' record on Indigenous housing.
There's a point of order that's been raised.
Thank you.
Yeah. Mr. Zimmer.
There's no, when we come here as opposition to question the minister for, they've been here for 9 years, houses are not getting built. I'm getting to it. And then we're questioned about the time and length of our question. When I'm talking about a story about Kevin and Malaya, people that are actually living in squalor because of this minister's inaction.
Mr. Chair.
If that's taking too much time, I apologize.
I have no problem with the time of the question.
Answer the questions we are asking of him.
I don't believe that's a point of order.
It's not a point of order. I agree with you. Moreover, I have no problem with the length of the question. I actually wish the previous questioner spent as much time on Indigenous housing. What I have problems with is the Conservatives trying to shut down an answer that may be uncomfortable for them. Because what I hear behind that question, coming from a member who opposes the very investments that are designed to address the needs he's raising in his question, when I know that he stands and votes against those measures, I ask myself, is he trying to score a point or to solve a problem? It's clear his interest is to score a political point, because when the Conservatives had an opportunity to make investments to build housing in Indigenous communities, they chose not to. When they have an opportunity to vote for or against investments to build more housing, they vote against. I will take with a grain of salt the continued interruptions, because this is uncomfortable given the historic record of Conservatives withdrawing investments when it comes to housing in Indigenous communities. So question away, take as much time as you would like, but let's engage in a real conversation rather than a cheap shot for Facebook.
You know, I've claimed my time back for the last minute because he's just been running off on an answer talking about a previous Conservative government. The questions are to the government that's been in power for 10 years, okay? His responsibility as minister to answer my question. And when you're not recognizing that I'm trying to claim back my time, Mr. Chair, you know, it's our time, it's not the minister's, okay?
I understand that, and you still have a minute and a half.
Okay.
It's not a point of order. That's not a point of order.
So is it my time?
Yes, continue.
Okay, can I?
We need a card system, I think.
Do I have my time?
It's running.
Okay. So, Minister, you haven't answered my question twice now. I've asked whether the previous two examples have been a success or a failure. You deliberately aren't answering that as success or failure. You're saying we're just going to throw more money at it or make bigger promises. Your government can't even plant 2 billion trees, and yet you're going to promise to build 4 million houses? You know, so it's still my question. So from an article from Nunavut, this is around the housing units promised in Tallywhack, including 2 5-plexes, still haven't been built because they're coming in at an extremely high cost of $1.1 million per unit. This is a quote. They were all just way too expensive, Kuzagak said. The Housing Corporation just doesn't have that type of money. This isn't the first time in recent years the Nunavut government has canceled projects due to the rising costs. Guess why? Canada's rising inflation rate, high fuel prices, and supply chain delays have affected construction in the territory. So, Minister, you're going to say it's not my responsibility, not my fault. You've been in government for almost a decade. It's all your fault.
Mr. Chair, I didn't hear a question at the end of that. However, I would point out that we're dealing with...
Has this been
Mr. Chair, do I have the floor?
Housing,
order, please.
Take my direction from you.
Mr. Zimmer,
Minister.
there's 10 seconds. Just Mr. Fraser, a short answer, and then we have to move on.
We have built more than 22,000 homes in Indigenous communities through the programs we've introduced since 2015. The Conservative government had a $300 million fund that had 99. I will not take lessons on delivery when it comes to housing in Indigenous communities from someone who votes against every one of the policies it would support when he's clearly motivated by his political interest rather than trying to help vulnerable communities.
Your time has elapsed. Point of order, Mr. Zimmer.
Yeah, the simple question, he asked me a question and I still had 10 seconds left. The question was whether you were a success or a failure. You clearly have been a failure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zimmer. Next, we have Mr. Carr for 5 minutes.
There we go. Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. My question will be to Minister Hajdu, but I offer the opportunity certainly for Minister Fraser to weigh in as well. Ministers, we heard a number of weeks ago that a part of what has posed an obstacle and an ongoing challenge for housing in the North is the impacts of climate change. Having sat on the Agriculture Committee over the course of the past number of months, we know that this is something that is posing significant challenges to farmers and to producers across the country, and it manifests, of course, in all sorts of different ways, whether that's in the agricultural industry, whether that's in the transportation industry, whether that's people just trying to partake in leisurely activities with their kids outdoors, but it clearly has also had an impact on housing costs and the conditions of housing in the North. I know in northern Manitoba, for example, where we are seeing recession in terms of permafrost, that's posing significant challenges with things like our rail line in Churchill and other pieces of infrastructure. Minister Hajdu, can you comment, please, on the ways in which you and your department have seen the impacts of climate change impact First Nations housing specifically? And Minister Fraser, if you want to talk about housing more generally speaking in relation to climate change, I'd certainly welcome those comments as well.
Well, thank you very much for a real question about, I think, a real challenge facing not just Indigenous communities, but communities across Canada. And with the advent of a warming climate and increasingly climate-related disasters, in fact, many of the visits that I've had the opportunity to have the pleasure of meeting with First Nations has been to communities that are working to rebuild homes and other infrastructure after a devastating climate-related incident, whether it's on the East Coast with torrential flooding, and I know MP Baptiste would know all about the kinds of impacts that flooding is having on First Nations communities, in particular around housing, but other infrastructure. Or, as I mentioned, Lytton First Nation or Squalex nearby, who suffered tremendous infrastructure loss. And not only is this, creating instability for First Nations communities. It's destroying functional infrastructure that costs, in some cases, millions of dollars to replace. Obviously, the more remote a community is, the harder it is to build. It's something that I think is really absent from the consideration of the questions that I've been hearing from the official opposition. Getting equipment, people, and infrastructure supplies to remote communities that are often not road accessible is an additional cost that has to be borne. And I will also say it also delays communities who are oftentimes have a variety of different things underway: economic development, projects of their own, infrastructure plans for investing in building up their communities. And when a climate-related disaster strikes, all of that is put on pause while the community responds to that crisis, evacuates its residents, sometimes for months and months, if not longer. And I will lastly say there are some communities, due to the historical location of their community, and you would know this very well, MP Carr, and you've been an advocate for communities in Manitoba, but some places like Peguis First Nation who see repeated flooding that really undermines the progress that they have been able to, inch by inch regain after significant flooding events.
Look, happy to supplement the answer. We see unique climate impacts in Indigenous communities and northern communities that disproportionately impact Indigenous peoples across Canada. Some of them can be building resilient housing that can withstand severe weather events. Other will require us to make better planning decisions and share information around where we're expecting more severe weather, whether that's floods. My hometown of hurricanes had a unique impact not only on Mr. Batiste community in Cape Breton, but the Pictou Landing and Buckanghamk First Nations in northern Nova Scotia as well. We also see unique, important factors to consider when it comes to housing in the north. The changing nature of permafrost on building practices, needing to build to a different code given the cold climate, the necessary infrastructure that can impact the ability and time at which you can ship or transport the necessary materials to build, all feed into it. In addition to understand the different nature of what it takes to build a home, when you consider the different impacts not only of climate change but the traditional climate. So this has to be front and center in all of our conversations. It's not good enough to build a house that will last the next few months. We have to build a housing ecosystem that will last a generation.
Thanks very much, Ministers. Appreciate the commentary on that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carr. We're moving on to our third questioner in the second round. Monsieur Lemire, vous avez 2 minutes et demie.
Mr. Lemire, 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. There's a major issue, which is ensuring that First Nations have expertise within their communities to implement projects. Ministers, how can you ensure that there are architects specifically who can develop structures, engineering or architectural structures in the communities? There's also the issue of insurance. I met recently with the Assembly of First Nations who told me that there's a real issue with insurance because the traditional ways of assessing whether a project has risk or not doesn't apply. We know that there's a traditional knowledge that is recognized. Same thing for raising capital. There are several initiatives, and there are examples based on savings within Indigenous communities. So how are you going to use all of that and have enough initiatives that develop Indigenous knowledge that is developed by and for Indigenous people in Indigenous communities? Thank you for the question. Excellent question. We have a new program for First Nations capacities.
The housing subsidy program, it was announced in budget 2022, and it includes $157 million to support the training of the kinds of experts that you're talking about, housing managers on reserve, which can help with the very issue of protecting the property, making sure the property is maintained, making sure that those assessments are up to date to address some of the issues you've identified, like insurance. We also received $66 million over 3 years to devote to training and certification and the provision of technical services for those First Nations housing managers. And I will also say that you mentioned using a partnership between government and private capital to accelerate building houses. So let me give you an example of some work that CMHC did and was announced April 18th, 2023. CMHC partnered with the Indigenous-owned private credit fund Keewatin Capital Inc. on a pilot project to build over 330 homes financed by private capital. And this is a way to start to demonstrate how that private credit can work as a viable, low-risk way to augment the investments that the federal government is making. So I think you're on the right track with the questions you're asking. That's exactly the direction that this government wants to go, is in those tools of self-determination, including the skills and the knowledge and the partnerships that often can be formed once that capacity continues to grow.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Maire.
Merci, Miigwech.
Thank you.
Notre dernier
And for our last member.
2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I'd like to remind everyone it is my understanding that the Auditor General's report is to look at Indigenous housing. It doesn't meet Inuit. It has no Inuit content, nor does it cover any Nunavut housing and Inuit housing needs. I know that. I'm asking you, I'm asking Minister Haidu. I understand that we are not involved with Nunavut on this issue, but I also represent Nunavut Inuit. And when we talk about Indigenous people, we talk about First Nations and Métis. And the Auditor General General's report. I ask you now, Minister Haidu, May 27 you responded that the Auditor General will be meeting with you. I'm not asking questions, but I am making a statement that you stated that the mandate of the government, and you did not agree with the Auditor General, that the First Nations homes and housing, why did you not agree with the Indigenous First Nations people?
Chair, I'm sorry, I'm on the House channel.
Quelque chose qui fait peut-être défaut au niveau technique, mais je suis dans un outil formel de la Chambre, donc c'est pas au niveau de ma connexion Internet. J'entends très bien, Madame Haïdout. J'ai la traduction en français qui se fait pas dans mon ordinateur.
Zoom. Oh, OK. OK. Peut-être c'est l'application.
Maybe it's the Zoom application, so we'll look at that.
Merci. Oui, je vous entends.
Okay, one more time, Ms. Didlout. You still have about 30.
Why did the Auditor General's report, why did you not agree with it? You were some things you questioned. Can you understand why you did not agree with some of the reports?
Thank you very much, MP Idlout. And listen, first of all, I think in general, we agreed with the majority of the Auditor General's reports. And I think that the focus on the gap for Inuit-specific housing is actually an area where we have recognized a gap in the Auditor General's report, although she specifically indicated it was not included for the reason that she said in the report, and that's why we supported a study with ITK on housing gap for Inuit specific. In addition, we have seen budgeted amounts in 2018, 2022, 2024 through Crown Indigenous Relations, who is dispensing that money in partnership with Inuit to close the housing gap in the north. And that amount is about $500 million with an additional allotment in 2024.
Thank you very much,
so
Mr.
we will
Haidu.
continue to focus on Inuit-specific
The
solutions.
timing is much elapsed here, so I'm afraid we're going to have to end it at that point. And I do want to thank Minister Haidu, Minister Fraser for, thank you, Ms. Idlout. And I do want to thank Minister Haidu and Fraser for being here today.
I do have
and I
a
want to
point of
excuse the
order.
witnesses while we suspend very quickly.
Point of order.
Okay. Point of order?
I thought I explained explicitly that I understood that we're studying First Nations housing, the Auditor General's report on housing for First Nations, and I explicitly explained that I know that this is not related to Inuit or Inuit lands or housing for Nunavut. So I was asking for an explanation as to why they disagree with the Auditor General's report, to explain, to clarify in what areas where they disagree with. Can I have the permission of the committee to have that written and have a written response?
Yes, absolutely, Ms. Idlout. Okay, so with that, we're going to suspend very shortly as our next panel is getting set up here. And so we will return in a couple minutes. And perhaps, Monsieur Lemire, I saw you had your hand up as well. Is this for translation?
Oui, effectivement, je ne l'ai pas arrêté.
Yes, indeed, I didn't want to interrupt, but I only heard the end of the minister's response. But thank you very much to the interpreters. It's very much appreciated, and I'm sorry about the inconvenience.
Being back to order. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted on Wednesday, April 10th, the committee is meeting to continue its study of Report 3, First Nations and Inuit Policing Program of the 2024 reports 2 to 4 of the Auditor General of Canada. I would like to welcome our witness, the Honourable Dominic LeBlanc, Minister of Public Safety, Democratic Institutions and Intergovernmental Affairs, who is, of course, flanked by officials, Mr. Sean Tupper and Christian Moran from the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, and Deputy Commander Brian Larkin and Assistant Commander Warren Brown from the RCMP. So with that, Minister LeBlanc, I will pass the floor to you for 5 minutes for your opening.
Mr. Chair, colleagues, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for introducing my colleagues from the Department and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police who've joined me. Mr. Chair, just by way of an opening, I know that you invited me for an hour. I'm happy to be here for an hour. I was here on time. You were running a bit late. And as I mentioned to some of you, I am seeing the National Chief on this very issue of Indigenous policing in my office in the Confederation Building at 1:15. So you'll understand at 1:05, 1:10, not to keep her waiting, that I will excuse myself. Colleagues, it is significant that today is the 5th anniversary. I just wanted to note that in the somber moment that it is of the release of the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. It struck me when I was preparing for this conversation on the weekend that we would be here on this very day. Monsieur le Président, je vous remercie de m'avoir invité à
Thank you for inviting me to appear before you today. I'm very happy to be able to speak about the Auditor General of Canada's Performance Audit Report on the First Nations and Inuit Policing Program. And I thank Auditor General Karen Hogan, with whom I had a very productive discussion. As you know, the FNIPP is an important program that aims to increase access to dedicated, culturally responsive policing services in First Nations and Inuit communities, consistent, of course, with provincial and territorial jurisdiction over administration of justice, including policing operations. The Government of Canada welcomes the audit report's recommendations. These come at a fitting time, as Public Safety Canada is currently exploring ways to modernize its programming for Indigenous people. This report will help guide the department and our partners like the RCMP to improve the delivery and impact of the FNIPP, including through measurable results in the communities it serves.
Chair, our efforts to act on the report's recommendations are already underway. That's what I was able to assure the Auditor General in my constructive conversation with her. For instance, Public Safety Canada has recently updated its internal structure to streamline the delivery of the program related to Indigenous issues, programs and policy work within our department's mandate. The Government of Canada is also committed to tabling legislation that recognizes First Nations police services as essential services, obviously as soon as is feasible, and we're well on our way to making this happen, and that is the subject of a conversation that I've had with the National Chief and other partners, but I'm going to continue that conversation, as I said, a little later this afternoon as well. In fact, over this past winter, Indigenous-led regional and national engagement sessions have been held on proposed legislative options to co-develop federal legislation to recognize First Nations police services as essential services. This engagement builds on the ongoing collaboration that our department has fostered with First Nations and subject matter experts, obviously like the First Nations Chiefs of Police Association and First Nations Police Governance Council, as well as, of course, provincial and territorial partners. Public safety has also revisited the program management relationship with the RCMP to more readily consider and integrate officer availability in program management decisions, which was the subject of some of the Auditor General's, I thought, fair comments. The RCMP is continuing to work with communities to improve cultural awareness and practices as they reaffirm their commitment to keeping Indigenous communities safe, including through the First Nations and Inuit policing program. I have had reassuring and constructive conversations with the Commissioner, Mike Duhem, and I have a lot of confidence in the leadership of Assistant Commissioner Brown and Deputy Commissioner Larkin, who are with me today. Pour conclure, Monsieur le Président, le gouvernement du Canada continuera.
To conclude, the Government of Canada will continue to work with our partners and our law enforcement agencies, provinces and territories. Provinces and territories decide what their needs are when it comes to policing in their own jurisdictions, define the priorities of the program, and pay for 48% of the costs. The federal government then cost matches the remaining 52%. In doing this work, it is important that we respect the constitutional division of power, and that poses a challenge, of course, but not an insurmountable challenge.
To continue to work, Mr. Chair, obviously with Indigenous communities who rely on these services, and it's their security and their safety that should guide all these efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. And with that, we'll go into our first round of questioning, starting with Mr. Melillo for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister, for being here. I guess we'll just start with an easy one right off the hop to get into this, Minister. Just a simple yes or no. Do you believe that First Nations policing is essential?
Yes, I do.
Okay. I appreciate that, Minister. I appreciate the answer. That's not something we get very often around here. But you say that you believe policing on First Nations is essential. You mentioned in your opening comments that the government is committed to tabling legislation. Unfortunately, this is something we've heard for a number of years now. Your predecessor, who was rightly removed from his position at the time in 2022, said that he was going to work around the clock to get this done. He said that it was right around the corner. This legislation would be here. And since then, we've seen delays. The government at one point began blaming the AFN for dragging its feet, which was a ridiculous assertion and an attempt to deflect from your government. But now you're the minister, and the buck stops with you. So why should Canadians and First Nations across the country believe you this time?
They should believe us because there has been a considerable body of work done in this respect. I referred to consultations that our Assistant Deputy Minister Morin has had and her colleagues have had across the country. These are ongoing conversations. As I said, I'm picking up the conversation with the National Chief later this afternoon. I don't underestimate the complexity of this initiative. I participated in a federal, provincial, and territorial meeting in Bromont, Quebec, with provincial and territorial ministers. They obviously have different views as to how this legislation might apply. As I noted, it's a constitutional jurisdiction they have, but that doesn't mean that we don't have an obligation to get it right. And I know the suspense has been terrible for you, but I think you should look forward to seeing legislation, I hope, in an appropriate moment soon.
Thank you, Minister. Again, I appreciate that. I want to stress again the urgency, because 2022, this is 2 years ago that your government's been dragging its feet. Since the commitment, of course, you've had 9 years in government, so ample opportunity to move this forward. I had an opportunity to speak with your Deputy Minister at a previous committee about this process, and he mentioned that it is, quote, simply the struggle of co-developing legislation. So, Minister, why is developing legislation in consultation with First Nations a struggle for your department?
I don't obviously think that working in a sensitive and appropriate way with First Nations partners is anything other than the appropriate way that we should be doing this work. My experience with the department is that exactly how they're approaching this work. And as I say, I have a lot of confidence.
So do you disagree with Mr. Tupper, your deputy minister? Do you disagree with his characterization that this is a struggle?
I
would agree with him?
I would never seek to disagree with a deputy minister as senior and as experienced as Sean Tupper.
So you do believe that it is a struggle for your department to work and collaborate with First Nations?
No, that's the word you're using.
That's the word that your deputy minister used on the record in committee.
But if you want to ask the deputy minister a question, you can. What I'm happy to tell you is that it's work that we're committed to doing, and the deputy minister and our officials in the department are doing, I think, very constructive and positive work. And he and I and Chris and others are going to meet the national chief to continue this work in a little less than an hour from now.
Okay. Thank you, Minister. I'd like to move into some details of the report that you're here to discuss. Of course, there's lots that is concerning. For me, in northwestern Ontario, Treaty 3 territory captures most of my riding. And what's concerning in our local context is that Treaty 3, as well as two other police services in Ontario, have had to take the government to court. They are fighting for equal recognition, and all of this happening, such a important, essential service as policing is, and we see that your department anticipates over $45 million in program funds will be left undispersed at the end of this fiscal year. Why?
Mr. Chair, our colleague asked a number of questions, and
Just one question.
Well, there was a long preamble where you referenced some of the Northern Ontario work, and in fact, some of the police leadership that has most inspired me has been from Northern Ontario. So I have learned a great deal from some of the police leaders in your part of our country, and I think we should acknowledge that that is a part of the country that has seen considerable success, and we need to find a way to support them. With respect to the lapsing
I appreciate
of
that, Minister.
money,
I appreciate that, but
I was about to answer your question on the lapsing of money.
$45 million on the table. Why are you not spending this money?
So I was obviously, when I read the Auditor General's report, that was a source of concern to me. I discussed it with the senior RCMP leadership in the department right away. One of the challenges is this program is a cost-shared program. So our contribution comes at the end of the process, once provinces or territories allocate their own money. And in some cases, and I referred to that in my opening comments, in some cases it has to do with the RCMP's ability to staff a particular position in a particular community. So if that particular position is not able to be staffed, that's a separate challenge that we're making considerable progress in addressing, and I hope somebody asks us about recruitment and retention for some of these positions in Indigenous communities, because there's a good story to tell there. But you can see the challenge. The department is not able to allocate money to a particular position that is not filled, nor are we able to, under a contribution agreement, able to allocate money if a partner hasn't matched the 48%. So it's not, there should be zero money lapsed. So the way to get to zero money lapse, and we should increase the funding, which we're prepared to do, the way to do that is to work with provincial and territorial partners, and the RCMP improve the way they recruit and retain, which is well underway. So I'm confident that that number should be diminishing rapidly, but we do need to work with our policing partners in different jurisdictions to get that number to zero. I don't want to pretend that we alone have the ability to drive that number to zero, but we're going to work with them to get it to zero as quickly as we can.
Thank you very much, Mr. Melillo. Moving on to our second questioner in the first round of the second panel is Mr. Pulowski for 6 minutes.
Hello. We've heard you talk, Minister, about co-developing legislation to make First Nation policing an essential service. But we haven't really heard what's the significance of that. So maybe I could ask you, what is the significance and what does that mean, practically speaking, for providing good quality policing in Indigenous communities?
Mr. Chair, so through you to our colleague, Mr. Pulowski, Dr. Pulowski, thank you. Thank you for the question. And as Dr. Pulowski noted, the designation of First Nations policing as an essential service, I think, confirms something that non-Indigenous communities have known for a very long time, that the ability to rely on professional, accessible, independent policing services is an essential requirement for communities to be safe, for communities to be able to grow, for families to be able to work and live in communities, and it should be no less so in Indigenous communities. But one of the things, and I learned this from representatives of policing services in Northern Ontario that is so ably represented by Dr. Pawlowski, what I learned is, imagine if you work for the Toronto Police Service, or heaven forfend the RCMP, Brian Larkin, and you didn't know on April 1st if you would have a paycheck, because it's a contribution agreement based on a certain number of fiscal years. Like, how do you train, recruit, maintain public confidence and the confidence of the officers who serve in these police forces if there isn't long-term, reliable, recurring funding? So the idea is to designate it as an essential service and provide legislative certainty as to the long-term, recurring nature of the funding. Because that will, and I learned this from police chiefs from Northern Ontario, be a lot easier for them to recruit and retain the kind of professional officers that they want to serve in their communities. And it speaks to the leadership in those communities being able to count on what is, as I said, in every other community, an essential service. So the idea that it sunsets with a contribution agreement wouldn't make sense in a non-Indigenous community. So we think it's a long overdue thing that we can correct, and we hope we can correct it legislatively. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. And maybe you've partly responded or answered this question with that response, but I certainly know that they have trouble recruiting people to work in Indigenous communities. And having spoken to one police chief recently, it seems this is a common problem across Canada, both within Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities. What are we doing in order to try to recruit more people into policing in general, but more particularly people to work in Indigenous communities?
So, Mr. Chair, with your indulgence, and Dr. Pawlowski, thank you for the question. It's a subject of conversations I've had with the leadership of the RCMP since I became the Public Safety Minister. But Assistant Commissioner Brown is in a great position, I think, to answer that based on his work. If it's okay, he might be able to give some more specific answers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The RCMP, along with other police organizations nationally right now, are having a very challenging time recruiting anybody, period. With that, in 2023, we started a very robust recruiting program. We launched a First Nations, Inuit, and Métis recruiting strategy specific to those designations to help increase the number of applicants and increase candidate retention. The key objectives of this strategy include targeted marketing and outreach, reduction of barriers for applicants, and the provision of support for applicants. Our goal is to reach 10% Indigenous cadets to depot by the year 2027. So it's just been this year since the pandemic. We are now up to 40 troops. We anticipate, or certainly have a goal of getting to 50 troops with a full 32 allotment within those troops. I recently attended depot last week. It was the 30th year for the Indigenous Pre-Cadet Training Program, the IPTP. It was their anniversary. We had a full troop with that. Many of these young adults are wanting to work not only in their own home communities, but other Indigenous communities. We have our second IPTP troop starting in August. So I think we're on a really good pathway as it is right now. Overall, the RCMP, we have about 2,500 vacancies. That's about a 15% vacancy pattern across the board for frontline policing. In our Indigenous communities, however, out of the 1,823 Indigenous employees we have about a 7% vacancy. So again, I don't say that's good, but I think we're making some pretty good headway. So I'm really optimistic that in years to come, we'll have a really good news story for you. Thank you.
Any consideration of recruiting specifically from the Rangers program? We've spoken to a number of Rangers. It's certainly a group which impressed me and seemed to be a potentially good pool for policing services.
Funny you should ask that question. One of the IPTP cadets, his brother attended for his graduation and was a graduate of that program, so he and I had a discussion, but I think that along with other initiatives we have locally in communities, including our Indigenous communities, are well underway.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pulowski. Après vous, on a Mr.
And the next speaker is Mr. Lemire, 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Just one moment.
Ma lumière, le microphone ne se connecte pas.
My microphone doesn't seem to be connecting. Mr. Lemire, we can hear you. Yes, I know. I just want to make sure that the sound is going through my headset. Thank you, Minister, for your presentation. I was happy to hear the Conservatives' question, but the timeline is getting very tight, and obviously the bill is taking a while to materialize. So if ever there's a change of government, are you worried that everything you've done will lead to naught?
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Lemire, for the question. It won't surprise you that I don't share the pessimism that you have about a change of government. Now, I'm not pessimistic because when it comes to supporting Indigenous peoples, well, I do understand the sentiment. Obviously, I'm teasing here, but I would have used the parliamentary calendar with an election at the latest in 12 months. So there could be an election at that point. So I'm very much aware of the timeline here. It is at the base of my conversation with the chief that will take place later today. I understand the goal of having a bill that defines funding and that has recurring funding, but obviously I understand, Mr. Lemire, you're very interested in issues of jurisdiction. And the truth is that it really is a challenge to find a way to pass laws here in the Parliament of Canada, but respect jurisdiction of provinces that are in charge of policing services. But I am very optimistic about my conversations with my counterpart in Quebec. The Sûreté du Québec is also extremely interested in collaborating with us, and so I'm hopeful, but of course we have to find a way of respecting the general objective, but doesn't put us in a situation where we'll find ourselves before the courts because we tried to infringe on provincial jurisdiction. So obviously you might think that we're not sensitive enough about it. I'll be honest with you, Minister. What I'm hearing on the ground is that there's a lot of discussion between the federal government and the provincial government on building these police forces, but there's not enough discussion with the Indigenous communities. First Nations want to know what's going on with the bill. We know that the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls called for several actions to be taken. Minister Haidu talked about the importance of dealing with all of these issues, but the main thing here is, when will the bill be tabled? When will these services be recognized as essential services and then receive the funding as a consequence? This is a discussion that we have in my own riding. It is something extremely important for the community in Long Point, among others, that no longer has a police service. So we want to know when this is going to translate into concrete action. Thank you for the question. And I heard similar encouraging comments about the will in your region, Témiscamingue, to train Indigenous police forces. So that is exactly what we hope to include in a bill. I don't want your Conservative colleague to come back to my predecessor's plans. We had a very ambitious timeline and we were not able to respect it. I'm very well aware, as you raised, of the parliamentary calendar, and I hope that there will be a positive development after my discussion with the Grand Chief today. And I think my colleagues are on the same page as me. Thank you. Minister Leblanc, I know you have a lot of political weight. I invite you to really make this a priority. If you look at C-38, C-61, other bills, Indigenous bills are not the priority of the government, but this needs to be a priority. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Lemire.
We have Ms. Idlout for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank all of you that you will be leaving soon and you didn't have much time, so thanks for warning us. I'd like to ask, according to the Auditor General's report, that only 38% of the communities in this program had a dedicated officer on site. The term of the program requires 100% capacity. Why is the RCMP not meeting its obligations? We are. Okay. I will repeat. According to the Auditor General's report, only 38% of the community.
Ça fonctionne très bien en français, Monsieur le Président, pour répondre à la...
It works very well. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Idlout, it seems to be working. You can continue.
Do I repeat the question? Okay.
I will repeat the question. According to the Auditor General's report, only 38% of the communities are participating in this program. Only 38% of the communities had a dedicated officer on site. The term of the program requires 100%. Why is the RCMP not meeting its obligations?
Chair, thank you for the question, and to Ms. Idlout, thank you for the question. That was also one of the things when I spoke to the Auditor General and when I read the report that was obviously a source of concern, as it would be for you and the people that you represent and other colleagues represent. There has been, and if in order to provide reliable, precise information, because I understand the importance for the communities, perhaps Assistant Commissioner Brown could provide some precision. The good news is at the time, so there are 443 positions contemplated in this agreement. At the time of the audit, there were 60 vacancies. That number has been cut in half, so it's down to 30. It should be 0. And we're working to get there, but perhaps Assistant Commissioner Brown could provide some specific answers to the precise communities that you're referring to where there were vacancies?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. This is a very complex matter whereby the provinces and the territories are responsible for the administration of the police. I noted in the Auditor General's report, this is clearly work that the RCMP need to improve upon, and we intend to do that with our counterparts at Public Safety Canada. We're not a signatory to the community tripartite agreements, and it's our experience in some communities there's perhaps not a great understanding of what enhanced policing is versus core policing. We would welcome the opportunity of the RCMP to be part of that table when CTAs or community tripartite agreements are renewed. As the Minister responded, out of the 146 CTAs, community tripartite agreements we have nationally with 443 members, we are seeing significant vacancies in other areas as well. So unfortunately, oftentimes when there's limited numbers of members in small remote communities, they have to provide a core policing function as well. So they're not adhering to 100% of their policing time. So we have to get better at that. So we've agreed with the Auditor General on that. However, with the optimistic and robust approach we have for recruiting, I believe that we can meet that measure in short time.
Thank you. Last question. You responded to my last question. I just want to remind everyone in Nunavut, our police are not present in every community, and it affects us in the community, in the territory. Pangnato, for instance, and Talodjok, and Nauyat, and Iqaluit. Those communities have headquarters. They start work at 8:30 and they complete the day at 4:30. When they are given a call after hours, they will respond. But in the evening after hours, after 4:30, in the evening until the next morning, if you call for the RCMP, nobody will not respond. Your call will be directed to the Iqaluit headquarters. Once your call is directed to the headquarters in Iqaluit, the recipient does not speak Inuktitut and does not understand the caller. Many people are appreciative that we have policing for safety, but their hours do not serve the community 24/7 as they should. Thank you.
So, Mr. Chair, Ms. Idlout, thank you for raising that issue. It's obviously very concerning. I'm happy to work with the leadership of the RCMP to see what we can do and work with you to ensure that that circumstance is mitigated and corrected. I'm encouraged by conversations I've had with the Premier of Nunavut. We have discussed I'm also the Intergovernmental Affairs Minister, so I have the opportunity in that function to talk to the territorial premiers, and I remember very clearly the desire of the government of Nunavut to work with the RCMP. The RCMP has a footprint in many parts, not all parts, as you noted, of your vast territory. But if there are ways that we can work to ensure that that footprint is more effective, and I'm obviously particularly sensitive to the linguistic piece that you raised, and I'm happy to ensure that we follow up directly with you and ensure that we speak directly to the communities you identified as well.
Thank you very much, Ms. Idlout. We are now moving on to our second round. And first, for 5 minutes, we have Mr. Shields. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here today. Minister, you've got a long history in working with government, so here's a couple of questions for you. The length of the tripart agreement, do you know the length of that agreement that's currently in place?
My understanding is they vary from different communities, so I
I'm
don't.
talking about the one that you and I know in our provinces, the tripart agreement. How long is that agreement? How many years?
The framework agreement is a 10-year agreement, but there are different. Is that your question? I want to make sure.
Tripart agreement that the provinces sign with the feds should be an easy answer. Should be. It's 20 years. I was at the table when that was negotiated the last time in 2012. That's a 20-year agreement you're talking about.
Sorry, I was just told by the Assistant Deputy Minister it's 5 years plus 5 years, but I think we should. I don't want to leave confusion at the table, perhaps, but we're happy to come back to that exact agreement with you. I don't want to leave.
Because it expires in 2032. It was negotiated and went into effect in 2012. It expires in 2032.
Maybe, Mr. Chair, and if we're talking about the contract policing, apologize. I thought you were talking about the contribution agreements with respect to First Nations and Inuit policing. The contract policing, you're absolutely right, expires in 2032.
And that's 48.52%, which goes to cover Indigenous people in a lot of provinces.
Again, I don't think that's accurate, but perhaps
you've referred to it a number of times here today already.
But that wasn't the contract policing that we sign with provincial governments to provide contract. That's the First Nations and Inuit policing program, which is separate from the contract policing program we have with.
I'm going to go back to that. It's a 20-year agreement that you and I have our policing through. So when we talk about Indigenous self-administered, what percent of those contracts are 1 year? Your self-administered policing contracts you're talking about, what percent are 1 year?
Again, I can't imagine this is deliberate, but there's a significant, certainly, confusion, I think, at this end of the table in terms of the agreements with provinces and territories to provide contract policing services like in the city of Moncton where I have a house.
Right.
And then there's the First Nations and Inuit policing program. That's the 4852 cost sharing.
Yes, got that. As you said, we're moving into the other one, the one that you've made with Indigenous. When we're talking about self-administered, what's the length of those contracts?
Mr. Chair, with your indulgence, I think the Assistant Deputy Minister might ensure that we all have a common basis of understanding with respect to these different contracts.
Thank you, Minister. There are two types of contracts under the First Nations Policing Agreement. There is a framework agreement with each of the provinces that FNIPP operates in, and those have, under the framework agreement, there are community tripartite agreements. But with respect to the self-administered police services, of which we have 36, those are separate agreements with provinces, the First Nation, and the federal government.
How long are those contracts?
Those contracts vary. They can be as long as 10 years, but it is at the discretion of the First Nation. So some of them, in fact, are 1 year.
Same as I was asking before. I asked how many are at 1 year, how many at 5, how many are at 10, and that's what I was looking for. Because we've got the main one we're talking about, you and I, we have 20 years in that contract, but we have none 20 years in those 38 agreements. Why?
So, perhaps, Mr. Chair, and it's a very good question, perhaps, Mr. Chair, I'll ask the department to come back to you with the exact number of years for the individual agreements, just so everybody has that information. But I think our colleague has identified, Mr. Chair, exactly the challenge that I tried to describe in my opening comments, because I think the point is absolutely valid. If in the contract policing between the province of New Brunswick and the Government of Canada, or a municipal police force that has the City of Toronto, SPVM, pick your municipal police force, that goes on year over year, that is the essential element that is not fair to the Indigenous policing communities, and that's exactly the issue that we're trying to address. So I think I share entirely our colleague's concern.
You've got it. What I'm getting back from those Indigenous leaders is that you won't give them the 20 years. They're telling me you won't go to 20 years. You're saying you're negotiating, that's their term. They're telling me you won't go there.
Again, there's a whole series of different contracts.
I got that, but I'm getting pushback from Indigenous chiefs saying you won't go to 20 years like you and I have. You won't go there.
And, well, that's exactly why, Mr. Chair, we think that it would be important to have the designation of essential services and the long-term funding, which it might be a 10-year agreement, renewable for 10 years. There's your 20 years. But they would know that their police services won't disappear and they'll be in perpetuity like in a municipality or our friends at the RCMP. So I share that concern.
Good. I have sat in phone conversations when the bureaucracy with chiefs, they didn't know I was there. They're pushing hard. I'm hearing the bureaucrats say no. So I hear that on phone conversations in person. I'm on. The bureaucrats don't know I'm there. The chiefs know I'm there, and that's why I'm there. Your guys are not going there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shields. And Minister, if you could actually submit that information to the committee on those 36 agreements, I think that would be very helpful. But with that, we're moving on to our second questioner in the second round, Mr. McLeod, for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Minister and his team that are here to talk to about Indigenous policing. It's a very important issue across the country, but in the riding that I represent, it's significant. We have 33 communities in Northwest Territories, and 12 of them don't have any police. So I don't believe those would be listed as vacant positions under your statistics, because there is no police. And the concern is that's being conveyed to me is that it's putting the leadership, who by default become the peacekeepers in the communities because there's nobody else there. It's putting them in serious, sometimes very dangerous predicaments. And I wanted to ask you to explain why no community in the Northwest Territories or Nunavut has signed a tripartite agreement to receive enhanced police services under the program.
Mr. Chair, so through you to Mr. McLeod, thank you for the question. And in a conversation you and I had some months ago, Mr. McLeod, I was surprised and, in fact, discussed with the RCMP, and in a subsequent conversation with your Premier, who has kept some of this responsibility for himself. I thought that was interesting in my discussions with the new Premier. The importance of working with his government. He echoed exactly the concern, Mr. McLeod, that you just shared with us around these communities that do not have specific police resources assigned to them. It is, as the Assistant Commissioner noted, a challenge across the country, but it's not one that should excuse a lack of police presence in communities that are in many cases isolated and would require that basic element of public safety. I don't know if Deputy Commissioner Larkin or Assistant Commissioner Brown can speak to the specific tripartite agreements in the Northwest Territories. Perhaps Assistant Commissioner Brown has that specific answer for Mr. McLeod.
Mr. Chair, and thank you for that question. I don't want to volley this back to our colleagues at Public Safety Canada. However, the RCMP is responsible for providing contract policing to a specific province or territory. Presently, we are working with Public Safety Canada, I believe, in a consultation phase. I'm not aware if we do have any CTA positions presently in the territories, but I'm hoping that we may get there. But I'm not aware of any detachment that is not staffed.
Okay. I'm going to interrupt you. Obviously, you're not getting to what I'm talking about. We seem to have a challenge in the Northern Territories about trying to have Indigenous policing into the territories. When I raised the question with the territorial government, they say they don't have the resources to cost share either RCMP or Indigenous police. And when I talk to the federal government, and you're the third minister I'm talking to, the response has always been there is no enabling legislation. Actually, I'm very disappointed that we're still taking this colonial attitude where we have to have the Indigenous government go to a third party for public safety. Why are we not engaging with Indigenous governments to set up policing programs when we have resources at the federal level, but we have no partners to take it on because the provinces in some cases, and in my situation, the territorial government doesn't have the resources to cost share. Why aren't we discussing this as a possibility for Indigenous governments to engage?
So, Mr. Chair, that's exactly what our objective would be, to have Indigenous governments and Indigenous partners lead the establishment and the maintenance of these police services. The challenge and this was my conversation with the Northern Premiers, the challenge is the provision of RCMP services, as the Assistant Commissioner noted, is subject to the contract that we would have with the government of the Northwest Territories. And they, in terms of allocating police resources in the territory, this is a constant challenge. They're correct. I see Mr. McLeod smiling. They're correct to identify the lack of funding as a concern.
I have to interrupt you because
Mr. McLeod, I'm afraid your time
it's become a hot potato, and it's. I hear you what you're saying. It's territorial government. Territorial government says it's you. Where does it end? Do communities have to declare a state of emergency before somebody will engage? There is no policing.
And I wouldn't, and I take your point, Mr. McLeod and Mr. Chair. I know we're out of time. I know in no way would I seek to pass the hot potato to the new Premier, with whom I had a very positive discussion. We got increased funding for Indigenous police services in the last budget. I committed to working with the Premier of the Northwest Territories and the RCMP leadership into finding the best way to deal with what, at the very root of your question, is a circumstance that should worry all of us.
Thank you very much, Mr. McLeod. Next, we are moving to Monsieur Lemire pour 2 minutes et demie.
2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Minister, for over 5 years, we've been waiting for developments with this bill. Is there a link between the Auditor General's report, the fact that you have been invited here at INAN, and the fact that you're meeting this afternoon with the Grand Chief? Mr. Lemire, I've already had discussions with the National Chief. I know that the Deputy Minister met with her a few months ago. I met her for the first time last fall in Winnipeg. So I understand the urgency of the situation. I accept it and recognize that this is not simple. If it were simple, then I think my predecessors would have closed this file already. But I do recognize the urgency, whether it's your region or Mr. McLeod's region, the Northwest Territories, or elsewhere. So I'm continuing my work, and I hope to move forward as much as possible and as quickly as possible. The expectations are very clear when it comes to First Nations. We want there to be more transparency. C61 about water was very much appreciated because it was co-created with Indigenous peoples. Is there something similar going on with this bill in order to really recognize Indigenous police services as an essential service? Once again, that's an excellent question. And the example of water is one that we should look at as an example. Yes, we have engaged in discussion with the Assembly of First Nations to co-develop the bill. The issue of inherent rights and the recognition of an essential service is a challenge for us. Some people have suggested that we should recognize the inherent right to police services, and of course you will understand, as I do, that comes up against constitutional issues that are very difficult to resolve. So I want to work with the First Nations and be inspired by the excellent example that you raised, but of course that doesn't stop us from continuing to work on this in good faith. Thank you, Mr. Lemire.
Questioner of the second panel here, Ms. Idlout, for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I want to, as I read the report, I hear and read that the police have no cultural training or cross-cultural training. They have no idea about Indigenous lifestyles, and they are not trauma-informed. So my question will be something like, the Auditor General's report found that RCMPs did not get neither cultural or trauma-informed training. Learning this, what changes will be made to ensure that both cultural-specific and trauma-informed training is provided to the RCMP?
For that question, and I too read that, and in my conversations directly with the Auditor General, discussed that very issue with her. I am, and the Assistant Commissioner identified some of the Indigenous troops that are going through Depot now. In my visit to Depot last fall, and in my conversations both with officials of the Public Safety Department and the leadership of the RCMP, I think that circumstance has been very significantly improved. I think that we can always continue to do better and to do more. But my conversations with both the Commissioner and my colleagues who are here today tell me that there are very specific training programs currently in place where not only obviously Indigenous members joining the RCMP, but all members who would serve in Canada's National Police Force would benefit from that culturally appropriate training and understanding. And maybe the Assistant Commissioner can provide some precise detail. I take the question in the earnestness in which it was posed, and certainly commit our government to ensuring that that is not a recurring circumstance. But I'm optimistic by the work that's been done, but the Assistant Commissioner can perhaps provide more specific reassurance than my words.
Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. We've just hired our first Inuit cadet will be attending Depot this month, and that's the first Inuit member we've hired in the past decade. We've just hired 2 operators in our dispatch center you spoke about earlier in Iqaluit who speak Inuktitut, as well as all front counter staff at Iqaluit detachment as well speak Inuktitut. We have a 40-hour training regime at Depot for all RCMP cadets for Indigenous studies. That includes the blanket exercise, but I was part of the very first training exercise last week where we now have a floor map journey. That's a more comprehensive lived experience for not only Inuit, First Nation and Métis people for significant dates and impact the RCMP have had. So I would suggest that, albeit we're not there, we're certainly getting there. The Management Action Board as well.
I'm afraid we're ran out of time here. But thank you very much, and thank you very much, Ms. Idlout. And with that, that concludes our second panel. I do want to thank Minister LeBlanc for appearing today, as well as officials from Public Safety and the RCMP. I know, Minister, you need to make it to a very important meeting, but thank you again for being here today. And with that, we're going to briefly suspend before we go in camera to do some committee business.